Zainab Badawi from the heart of Sri Lanka's capital, Colombo. I'm outside the presidential office, and today its pristine exterior is well guarded. But 6 months ago, angry anti-government protesters stormed this building as well as the presidential palace, forcing the president to flee the country. They were angry at just how desperate their economic situation had become, and they blamed government corruption and mismanagement for it. Sri Lanka is saddled with heavy debt, soaring inflation and impossibly high food and fuel costs. And it's become something of a bellwether for other lower-income countries. World leaders are looking to see whether Sri Lanka can overcome its worst economic crisis for more than 70 years, and whether its experience marks a growing trend of civil unrest. Welcome to the magnificent National Museum here in Colombo, which charts the history of this beautiful island as it marks 75 years of independence from Britain. And we've got a top panel here from Sri Lanka who are going to be answering questions from our local audience. Let me tell you who's in the hot seat for this edition of Global Questions. Ali Sabri is Sri Lanka's foreign minister. Until very recently, he was Minister of Finance and hence played a leading role in international negotiations for an economic bailout. At the end of last year, he held high-level talks in Washington about the economic and political crisis. Harini Amarasuriya is a member of parliament for the National People's Opposition Party. She's a former lecturer at university and is a vocal critic of the government. And Dushni Veerakoon is one of Sri Lanka's leading economists. She was a member of the board of the central bank and is a consultant to various bodies such as the World Bank. She's also executive director of the Institute of Policy Studies of Sri Lanka. That's our panel. Welcome to you all. And remember, you too can join the conversation. It's hashtag BBC Global Questions. Lots of questions to get through, so let's go to our first one from Ranmini Ariyawansha. Ranmini.
How can Sri Lanka survive in a global crisis like this? Will this not lead to more civil unrest?
Foreign Minister Ali Sabri.
Thank you very much for that question. It's a very difficult time for all of us. I hope that I had a ready-made answer for that. You don't have it. It's not easy. Let's be frank with that. Internationally, prices have gone up. Rupee has depreciated, particularly the energy, petroleum, coal, 35% of whom we are relying on for our electricity, grain and all those things. But what we are trying to do is to control the inflation, curb the demand so that the inflation is controlled. I think we have seen some positivity. 95% of the inflation which was in June, July had come down to 70 or 60%. That's the food. And the general inflation has also have come down from 85% to 50s. So therefore, I think there is no quick fix, but the only way out is to increase the export, reduce the import, preserve the dollars, and repurpose it for import of important items which is necessary for day-to-day movement.
All right, and Ranmini's second part of her question was, could it lead to more civil unrest? Are we going to see millions of people out on the streets again?
Yeah, hopefully I don't see that. But I feel that there is a little bit of progress. I think you will agree with me compared to what as this the initial the visual shows. We don't have the fuel queues any longer. We have, and that also been because we introduced the QR code, as a result of which the 40% of the demand has been cut off. And that's a result of it. We are serving a lot of foreign currency, which we have been repurposing.
All right, so the answer is no. You're not going to see people on the streets
I
again.
don't see so.
All right,
I'm optimistic that we could get out of it.
Let's see what a member of the opposition thinks. Harini.
Well, I think there's a lot more that needs to happen before we can be guaranteed that people will not get on the streets, because the key problems that led to the crisis have not been resolved. We talked about, Minister Sabri talked about the fuel crisis, but what we are seeing now, the lack of queues, is not because there's a sufficient supply of fuel, it's because fuel has been restricted. So this cannot go on indeterminately. There has to be some resolution for this. And also what I see is that this is not just an economic crisis, this is a political crisis. When people got on the streets last year, people were demanding a change in the political culture. They were demanding a
Well, they
change in
saw
the
off the
political
president,
system.
didn't they? I mean, Rajapaksa
Yes, they
fled
got-
to
that's
Singapore
part one.
and resigned by email from there.
That's part one. That's that they got rid of someone they didn't like, but have we replaced the person we didn't like with the person that we have chosen? We haven't.
Dushni Verakun, your response to that question.
Well, I think Sri Lanka is, I mean, we are through the worst of the crisis, but I think that we are certainly not out of the woods yet. If the economic downturn is prolonged and recessionary conditions drag on, there is a sense that, you know, people's lives are not improving, their livelihoods and their basic sort of living standards are not going to see much improvement over the next 2 to 3 years. So it can lead to a sense of frustration. And I think it's quite right that this is not only an economic crisis, it is also a political crisis, loss of faith in governance and our political institutions. So there has to be some sense of momentum that the problems have been recognized and some changes are coming.
Otherwise, what would happen?
Otherwise, I think sense of frustration can spill over into a repeat of what we saw.
Thank you very much indeed. Let's go to our second question. Anoka Aberatna, your question, please.
So how can corruption, which is the leading reason for why the country is where it is now, be curbed to ensure sound policies and governance?
Oh, Anoka's sticking out her head there, isn't she? So we know about all the external factors that have gone on, but Anoka's question is that the internal factors, principally corruption, is the culprit. Let's go to you first, Harini.
Yeah, I think that's the key issue. If you look at the protests last year, one of the key demands of people was give our stolen money back and hold those who are responsible for corruption accountable. So addressing that is critical, but that requires a political change, a political reform. And that's what the point I made earlier as well. If we see this purely in terms of an economic crisis, that would be missing the big picture. This is a political crisis. And the decisions and choices that politicians have made led to this crisis. And those politicians have to be held accountable for the decisions they made and the consequences and the suffering that people have had to undergo as a result. So unless that accountability is taken care of, I think we will never be able to really resolve this crisis.
Right.
And in that, corruption is key.
Okay, just everybody here in the audience in Sri Lanka is aware of what's been going on, but just give a quick couple of lines to our audience out there when you said stolen money. What do you mean exactly?
Well, during the protests last year, one of the key demands of the people, of the protesters, was give our stolen money back. That was one of the big slogans,
Yeah,
and
sure.
that was from the idea that people had, that the economic crisis that they were experiencing.
Yeah, but I mean, how are these, are you talking about misappropriated funds,
misappropriation,
economic mismanagement,
wastage,
backhanders?
excessive privileges that people in power enjoy, backroom deals, commissions, all of these issues.
And this has been going on for a very long time.
This has been going on for years, and that's why I think it's also important to recognize that this is not just about COVID or the last 3 years. This is something that is systemic.
All right. Ali Sabri.
Yeah, corruption is one of the emblematic problems, but then we have, by the 21st Amendment, restored the independent councils. We are in the process of developing that, and then by that we have recognized the Anti-Corruption Convention, and also the anti-corruption law will come into the place. But corruption is one of the key demand and very popular one, but to be honest, that's not the only thing. We have an extra large size public service of 1.6 million people, which works out to 16 to 1, whereas India has 177 to 1, which we can't account for. 86% of our last year's revenue went only for payment of salaries, so you can't run a country like that. Out of 70% of our entirety of the budget this year went for loan payment and loan interest repayment. So it's easy to say that the corruption is alone. It's just a one point. There are massive reforms which are necessary.
But it is a factor.
Of
You're
course
saying
it
it's
is a
one
factor.
amongst a few.
Yes,
But what
yes.
tangible actions and mechanisms are being implemented to ensure that you have that accountability of funds in the
Yeah,
country?
we are looking at an anti-corruption law in the style of Hong Kong. to give further power to the independent commissions of corruption and bribery so that more prosecutions can take place.
Harini wants to say something to you,
Yes,
Ali
I-
Sabri.
just in
Say it to
response.
him, not to me. You're looking at me.
But I think the issue here is that corruption, as we've understood, it's systemic here, right? And it's not just a case of it's about holding people accountable. This government has been in power for 3 years already. 3 years now? 2.5, 3 years? Where is the accountability? What has really happened even when they've been in power, right? And what about the ongoing corruption? There have been instances right now, as we speak, of corruption going on. Minister also spoke, you also spoke about the bloated public sector. Who's responsible for
Yeah,
that? Who
well,
hired those people?
We're going to
right?
come to that a little. I'm so sorry, Ali Sabri, Minister, but they like what Harini is saying, and you didn't get any applause for that answer. But anyway, let's see what Dushni has to say. Dushni, your response to the question about corruption.
Well, I tend to agree with what the minister said, to the extent that corruption is one of the manifestations of the broader issue of loss of accountability and weakening of institutions that we've had. And I think we can have certain structures and places in place, but I think one of the biggest areas or reforms that people are demanding is actually in the political leadership, because corruption has not sprung on us overnight, and the economic crisis did not spring up overnight either. This has been successive governments over the last few decades where we have persistently seen institutions being weakening. So there is no quick fix.
All right. I'm going to take the next two questions together because they both ask something that's related. So let's go first to Tanuki Gunasinghe. Tanuki.
How important does the panel think welfare reforms will be in the coming months to support those most affected by the cost of living crisis?
Okay, thank you. And let's go to Mahisha Veerasinghe.
A nutritious meal for children and the general population as a whole has been absent for a long time. What are the immediate steps that have been taken that would be successful even in the long run?
Dushni, I mean, two questions there. One is about sort of emergency welfare for people who are in a desperate situation right now. I mean, people are sort of choosing about whether they should eat, whether their children should eat, which child should go to school, which child shouldn't go to school. I mean, you know, it really is a dire situation, and what can be done in the long run?
Well, I think there has not been a disruption to the Sri Lanka's welfare schemes related to school children. There is a free midday meal. Our schooling is accessible to all at no cost. The issue is that we've had significant high food inflation in this country, running at over 90%. So whatever midday meals were being provided by the government, you are not able to provide that same meal now because the cost has almost doubled. And unfortunately, given the fact that we are in a economic crisis and the government needs to cut back on expenditures, means there isn't that amount of funding there to top up what we should have topped up by now. So I think all of this means we are relying on multilateral agencies to provide some funding, but in the long term we need to get all of the IMF programs, all of that tightened up so that budgetary support comes to scale these up. Otherwise, it will continue to be a big problem.
Okay, Harini Amarasuriya, I mean, the United Nations is really sounding the alarm bells. You know, they're saying that half of the population in Sri Lanka could really fall into poverty.
So there's a huge problem with targeting and with effectiveness of existing welfare programs. That is also due to heavy politicization of welfare programs, where governments that come into power tend to provide the welfare based on political affiliation rather than actual need. So that has become a major burden on the welfare programs in general.
All right, Minister Sabri, your response
Yeah.
to the question.
One of the conditions of the IMF program is also to roll over a social protection net to see the most vulnerable there. And of course, the midday meal program is going on. But generally, about more than 3 million families had been covered. But I do agree there are some verification need to be done. There are some people who have already been graduated from these projects but still getting it. There are some who have been left out. They need to come. There is a new program which is going on along with the World Bank in order to identify that and upgrade that. So
But
that
time is running out, isn't it, Minister?
Yeah, but
I
then
mean,
already
people
from
are
April-
really very hungry right now, and the government is, it seems, virtually on the verge of bankruptcy. I mean, even the president said a few months ago, President Vikramasinghe, that trying to find $1 million was a bit of a challenge.
Yeah. So, of course, but if you look at it, about 700 million worth of US dollar worth of funding came in from the multilateral agencies, and larger part of it, about 350 million US dollars, were directed towards the social security net, and that is how we have been Of course, we all tend to agree. There is no two word about it. We are not out of the wood. People are suffering, but if you look at from the March and the May, what people told that we will starve in September, starve in October, that had not happened because a lot of funding was put in to fertilizer.
Yeah, but it
and
might happen. It
yes.
might happen, right? It might happen.
It has happened. There are people going hungry as we speak. So it's not as if we are out of the woods. I mean, we
Of
do
course we are
get
not out of the
reports
woods.
from
Yeah,
schools
yeah.
of children fainting during a school assembly because they go to school hungry. It's also not just about filling your stomach, it's about nutrition. And that's the real issue, whether they're getting nutritious food, whether they're having access to nutritious food. So there really needs to be some emergency response, and that
you
needs to
don't see
happen
that.
now.
You
Not
don't see-
enough, not in the
Not
scale that
enough.
is required.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's go to our next question. Talal Rafi, your question, please.
Sri Lanka has one of the largest public sectors in the world, around 1.6 million people for a population of 22 million. And according to a minister, 86% of government revenue goes to paying salaries and pensions. So this is definitely unsustainable. So how can we reduce this?
Ali Sabri, I mean, if you include the defence forces, the army in Sri Lanka is huge. And, you know, as the question has just said, we've seen various figures between 70% and 80% of national spending goes into paying salaries. That's insupportable, isn't it?
Yeah. For the last year, it went 86% of it. Right now, it has come down to 65% because our revenue has gone up because of the new...
Okay, but still very high.
Very, very high. We all tend to agree. But the problem is, some of my friends' party goes into the university, drag down the people to the street, not get them to study, and then once they come back, they are not employable. When they are not employable, they force them to give their government job. They organize themselves. They organize themselves as unemployed graduate union. They want to fix the public sector. Public sector is bloated. So these are challenges. But this is not a time to point fingers at each other. All of us are to be blamed on this. No, because 1971, the uprising, 1988 to 89 uprising, all have contributed to this. Nobody is free. None of them they are trying to say that they are paragon of virtue. No, that's not the case. They are also responsible. My party is also responsible. All the parties are responsible for what we are today, 75 years. It is a moment of truth. We all must be honest to admit that and to deal with it.
I think that's a really callous response to the situation that we are in right now. People are not getting on the streets because they choose to get on the streets. They're getting on the streets because there are actual problems. I think it's a very glib answer to say that it's the education sector that's to blame for the poor economy in this country. The economy is the response that the economy needs to produce enough jobs. The economy needs to be resilient enough to absorb those who are coming out of the university system. We do not have that. And people are getting on the streets, and this very government, including the President Ranil Wickremesinghe, was quite happy to see students on the streets before he became president of this country, and now students have become enemy number one. That's not fair. That's not fair. He has to remember how he got to the position that he is. He's an unelected president, and he got to that position because of the protests on the street. So now to blame students for what is happening is really not taking responsibility for the conditions that created the situation that led people to the streets.
Just remind people, Ranil Wickremesinghe was Prime Minister at the time when Gotabaya Rajapaksa left office in July. He then became president, and a lot of people in Sri Lanka believe he obviously does not have a mandate to be as president. But how does this relate to the question that was asked by Talal about how you can reduce the bloated size of the public sector?
Exactly. So that has to be... Sorry, Hari, please go ahead.
Yeah. You're being very polite with each other now, aren't you?
We are polite, and which is my colleague.
Well, the public sector certainly, our position is the public sector needs to be strengthened. Strengthened doesn't mean expansion or bloating. And if you look at why the public sector has been bloated, and if you look at in which sectors it's been bloated, it's in areas, in resources where, you know, it's people who are really unproductive who've been chucked into the public sector, where there are lots of vacancies in areas that actually need to be filled.
I've got to bring Dushni, you've got to break up this bilateral at the side here. Dushni, your response.
I mean, I think Sri Lanka has a public sector that's far too large. There is no dispute about it. And the reason why it's grown in size is also political, because each government that comes in has, you know, they come under pressure to absorb more and more people into the public sector. Some of it is unemployed graduates, but a larger chunk of it is also politicians providing employment to their supporters through the institutions that they control.
Thank you.
Now, yes,
Yeah,
so
we're
that's
running out of time, so let's go to our next question. Nuji Mayan, your question, please.
So my question to you is, what are your thoughts on which countries Sri Lanka should look at aligning themselves economically in order to stem the cost of living crisis, given Sri Lanka's current precarious financial predicament, as well as for future growth and sustainability?
Dushni, you kick off on that one.
I think if you look at long-term economic interests, my sense as an economist is that we are better aligned to the Asian region, because Asia has been identified as the center of growth for the next 2 to 3 decades. Most of our investment is coming from Asia, most of the technology transfer is coming from Asia, most of our imports are coming from Asia. Our exports are, of course, headed to the West, but we need to diversify our export base, find new markets, and I think for us, finding new markets will also be mostly in the Asian region.
All right.
So that's
short
my
answer there.
Short
Very
answer.
quick answer to that one. I mean, China, India, Japan, big countries that give a lot of money to Sri Lanka.
I agree with Dushni, because we need to work with everybody, but Asia, this is the century of Asia for at least next 2-3 decades, so we had to work with them. India is growing, you have to partner with them, integrate with them, and have that opportunity to use it. So as far as China is concerned, we need to look at it, how to export more than now we are importing. So that's where it is.
Very quickly on China, Harini, maybe you could address this. A lot of people are unhappy about the fact that China builds these infrastructure projects, but at hugely inflated costs, and then there's this debt that's built up, and they buy the family jewels,
Well,
like the port.
I think that's part of the earlier issue we spoke about of corruption.
Yeah.
But actually, the biggest problem with indebtedness is not really China; it's the international sovereign bonds, which have been, which we borrowed on privately. So that's the real problem, not so much the bilateral loans that we've taken.
Thank you. Final question, Ulfath Pfizer. Your question, please.
Thank you, Zainab. A lot of Sri Lankans are migrating and are on the verge of migrating. As much as it does help generate foreign exchange to the country, in the long run, we are losing top talent and prospective entrepreneurs. Also startups and many other various skills that could lift the country to a much better state imaginable. What reforms and policies can we adapt to identify and retain young talent?
Okay, very important question, but I'm afraid we can't really go into reforms and policies, but it is a sad state of affairs. More than 300,000 people left the country last year. That's the highest figure ever. Very quickly, Dushni.
I mean, we are losing talent that we really can't afford to, because Sri Lanka is a rapidly aging demographic. We need our young people, and the only way that we can keep them back is to give them a sense of some material systemic change that's going to come to the country on the political front as well as on the economic front. If they don't have that confidence, they'll keep leaving.
Arina?
People are leaving because they've lost hope, and they don't think that they can build a future in this country, and that needs to change. People have to have hope. People have to have confidence that they can carve a life out for themselves in this country, and for that, there needs to be political change.
Minister Ali Sabri, final point. point?
Yeah, I feel there has to be deep economic reforms as well as structural and political reforms, because this, though we say that a lot of people have gone, yes, 312,000, but even in 2014, 304,000 people left. They always, they will go for better standard. So what the alternative is to provide an opportunity here in Sri Lanka so that we can retain them and there is opportunity for them. But even in India, in the early 80s, people started to go. Now they have come back and they have started coming back. So I'm hopeful if we all work together without this partisan approach, we can rebuild our country.
Foreign Minister Ali Sabri, Harini Amarasuriya, Opposition MP, and Economist Dushna Verakun, thank you very much indeed. That's all from this edition of Global Questions on whether Sri Lanka is managing to put a lid on the political discontent which was triggered by that economic crisis. And I hope we've also discussed some of the lessons learned for other countries beset by similar problems. Remember, we are the programme that brings you the trend lines behind the headlines. From me, Zainab Badawi, from here in Colombo. Thank you to you wherever you're watching or listening to this programme. Me and the rest of the Global Questions team, goodbye. Thank you.